Hello, everyone. Welcome to Season 3 of Chebacco Chats. My name is Jenna Jandreau, and I am your host today for Episode 6. We will be talking about a reprint that we are doing in the new edition of Chebacco on Arthur Train and an apocalyptic prophecy that he had about automobiles being allowed on Mount Desert Island. And so I'm going to share my screen here because I am going to be your host today. We do not have a guest, so I'm going to present myself. So give me one moment. There we are. So episode 6 is about the Isle of Mount Deserted, a prophecy by Arthur Train. Arthur Train was a lawyer and a writer. He was creator of the character Ephraim Tutt, born in 1875, passed away in 1945. Arthur was born in Boston and died in New York. He was a writer of very popular legal thrillers. And as I said, in the upcoming edition of Chebacco, we are going to reprint his apocalyptic prophecy and what he considered might happen on MDI if automobiles were allowed onto the island. I will get back to that in a bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about Arthur before that. This is the article that was printed in the New York Times when Arthur passed away. So it shows he died at the age of 70. He had just been reelected as president of the National Institute of Art and Letters. His literary career spanned over a quarter of a century, and I find this absolutely fantastic. He wrote 250 short stories and novels. Arthur was born and raised in Boston's Back Bay, which may be familiar to some of our viewers. He had, his father was the Attorney General for Massachusetts from 1873 until 1890. And he actually brought Arthur to call on very famous figures such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, James Russell Lowell, and Oliver Wendell Holmes. So while Arthur was being kind of primed to be a lawyer, he was also meeting some really incredible writers. Arthur was a graduate of Harvard, and he also was a Harvard law man. He served for years as district attorney and assistant district attorney in New York and Massachusetts, but he always had this desire to be a writer. So there's this wonderful article that I found through the Jessup's collection called Mount Desert Writers by Herbert Edwards. And in it, it says, one day, Arthur, quote, spent an afternoon upon the cliffs of Otter Creek at Mount Desert, weeping bitter tears of frustration because he seemed doomed to be a writer of briefs rather than fiction. But not for long. In 1904, Arthur had his first story published, which was The Maximilian Diamond, and then his first book was published in 1905 called McAllister and His Double. Arthur paid attention to the good advice sometimes of writing what you know. He wrote books from the perspective of a lawyer and in the courtroom. So Ephraim Tutt was his most popular character. He was a country lawyer who smoked cigars, and I kind of pictured Matlock kind of guy. He apparently looked like a cross between Abraham Lincoln and Uncle Sam. Some law schools actually made Mr. Tutt's casebook, which was written by Arthur Train, required reading in their classes. Tutt's stories were published in the Saturday Evening Post, and then Train also published 14 books with Ephraim Tutt as the main character. So some people, actually, lots of people actually thought that Ephraim Tutt was a real lawyer. Arthur Train was accused of fraud because somebody called Ephraim Tutt to the stand in a law case and he wasn't there to appear. I think that's hilarious. In 1911, he aided in the organization of the Authors League of America to protect writers from some unscrupulous publishers, and he later served as its president. I'm curious if anybody knows anything about the Authors League of America. It ended up changing its name and has somewhat of a local connection now. Arthur had a home at 113 East 73rd Street in New York, and he also had Saul's Cliff in Bar Harbor. He married Ethel Kissam in 1897. She passed away in 1923, and then he remarried to Helen Coster Gerard in 1926. With those two women, he had 5 children combined. So what I'm showing here is a photo from the MDI Historical Society's collection, and this photo was taken in 1919. And Arthur wrote this prophecy in 1907 called The Isle of Mount Deserted, Pleasures and Amenities of Life at Bar Harbor in 1920, after the automobile invasion, a prophecy by Arthur Train. So this prophecy was published in the Bar Harbor Record in 1907, but he's talking in the story as if it's 1920. And at this time, Mount Desert Island was undergoing what is often referred to as the Auto Wars. We have some really interesting Chebacco chats about that topic, and I think it'd be great if you went and checked those out because we've talked about those in depth before. But just to put it into a little bit of background there. So while there were notable exceptions, generally speaking, year-round residents were in favor of having automobiles on Mount Desert Island in the early 1900s, recognizing new and increased opportunities in both infrastructure and independently owned businesses, as well as a desire to own and operate a steam, gas, or electric car of their own. Garages, car dealerships, and mechanics would all be necessary to service and sell cars and car parts. Doctors could get to patients faster. Laborers could easily travel to other towns for work. Locals could take pleasure drives around island roads or to Ellsworth and elsewhere. Certainly the summer residents and seasonal visitors brought in a great deal of money each summer, but allowing auto traffic would appeal to visitors from the region who wanted to come for the day or for a short trip. It's from the introduction to our reprint. The summer residents, however, saw things differently. Many came to the island year after year, specifically to escape traffic, pollution, and noise associated with automobiles and large cities, and the island's rustic charm was its chief attraction. In light of the increasing alarm that cars would ruin Mount Desert Island, an apocalyptic work of fiction was published in the Bar Harbor Record, envisioning what the island would look like should cars be allowed. And it begins such. It was one July 4, 1920, 10 years after the evacuation of Mount Desert. And besides being, 10 years after the evacuation of Bar Harbor by its summer residents, that I determined to revisit the scenes of my youth and observe what changes, if any, time had wrought there. So one of the things that Arthur Train prophesizes is that, in quotes, Bass Harbor is today the commercial center of Mount Desert. And besides being the terminus for the Boston and Maine Railroad, it is the end of the regular motor run from Bangor and Ellsworth. So I thought that was interesting. And he goes into why Bass Harbor becomes the commercial center. The erstwhile little fishing village is now a thriving town with 2 large hotels owned by Mo Levy of New York, one of them having 1,000 fully furnished rooms, 14 garages, 2 gasoline factories, car works, and train sheds. Excursionists visiting Mount Desert are carried direct to a point whence sightseeing automobiles start every 40 minutes, making the trip around the island in a little over an hour, and allowing the tourist time to eat his lunch in one of the many beautiful picnic groves overlooking the sea and still catch an afternoon train for home. I thought that was a really interesting, the 1 hour long trip. So I don't know if you heard him mention Mo Levy of New York as owning 2 large hotels, but I had to look him up. I did a little bit of research and I found this advertisement from 1901 in the New York Times. So apparently Mo Levy had many shops in the city in New York, in Brooklyn, the Bronx. And so here's one pictured on the right. You'll see the sign going horizontally on the right. I mean, vertically on the right is Levy's. And then there's an advertisement on the left. So something else that Arthur Train believed was that the surrounding scenery would have suffered in appearance owing to the extensive conflagrations occasioned by the explosion of gasoline tanks and from the Great Fire of 1910, which devastated the entire island and originated from the same cause. So apparently cars caused explosions that burned the island down in 1910. Perhaps the most promising building architecturally is the Mount Desert Surgical Hospital, the generous gift of the Automobile Trust, where thousands of cases are treated annually. So obviously Arthur Train has a way with words, and he goes for big and he goes for dramatic. One of the interesting things about this being in the paper is that Arthur was one of the prominent, well-respected community members in Bar Harbor. And so the fact that he was saying these things and had such a strong opinion held a lot of weight. So in this prophecy, the man decides to get a sightseeing tour. So he secures a front seat next to the driver of one of the sightseeing coaches. Foley's furious, frantic, frenzied, terrific 25-cent tours around the island in 40 minutes. He turned a crank, and amid a series of deafening explosions, the car started slowly forward. In a few seconds, we were thundering through the remains of Southwest Harbor and on towards what used to be Soamesville. The tour guide ends up telling him that everybody that cut any figure has gone long ago. And then once the passenger asks about where all the horses are, and he goes, horses, there isn't a horse on the island, except one they keep in the museum that kicked a motor car off Beach Cliff and went right on feeding. So this postcard was used as propaganda in 1907 during these auto wars to convince island residents of the dangers and expenses of allowing automobiles on the roads. It says, an object lesson for automobile enthusiasts on Mount Desert Island. This is bad enough, but what would happen if the team were going in the opposite direction? If automobiles are admitted, the taxpayers must widen the roads. Back to Arthur Train's prophecy, he says, every moment some motor shrieked by us, tooting its horn and poisoning the clean air with its noxious gases. I don't see any dogs, I ventured. They're extinct, answered Foley, going on to explain that they had all been hit by automobiles. He also says that Newport Mountain remains nearly the same, though the enormous white advertisement of an automobile company somewhat disfigures the cliffs upon the ocean side. You ought to auto, try our motors and die happy. Schooner Head has also been turned into a pleasure park, and the Mount Desert nurseries make excellent truck gardens. As we started down the hill at Mr. George Doerr's gate, a scene of devastation came to my saddened eyes. The beautiful trees which once lined the road are most of them broken short off, owing to the careless driving of inexperienced chauffeurs and a cloud of poisonous smoke, ever hovering overhead, has killed every green thing for 20 feet on each side of the driveway. Why are there no people in the streets? I inquired. Foley gazed at me in pity. You are like the rest, he sighed. When they first let in the whiz chariots, folks thought that it would whoop up business to beat the band. The hotels all built additions and every stable was turned into a garage. The storekeepers laid in new stock and every restaurant in town hired a corps of extra waiters. Then everyone got ready for the boom to come. It was a farmer from Trenton that had mortgaged his house and bought an old secondhand buzz buggy for $375. He came popping down from the bridge while the selectmen lined up and cheered. Well, the farmer, he ran over 4 dogs, knocked down the village clock, upset the SPCA horse trough, ran his machine into the post office, and frightened 39 horses on Main Street, all of which ran away. It's not hard to see how he would have been a popular writer. So in addition to writing about the propaganda, anti-car that Mr. Arthur Train was, he does end his whole, kind of finalizes and concludes his whole prophecy with, "This ain't no summer resort, it's a graveyard." Pretty soon the automobilists began to come, shoals of them, but they was all farmers from Lemoyne, Hancock, Franklin Roads, Cherry Field, and Machias. The town looked in vain for the champagne drinkers and money tossers that had been expected. The tourists that did come brought sandwiches with them, and after running around the island, went home again. It was a regular sell. No one bought anything at all. The hotels all went bust. The old ladies refused to come back, and the cottagers moved away. And that last bit there, the cottagers moved away, was kind of a veiled threat, because that's what they were saying they would do if automobiles were allowed onto the island. So as we do know, automobiles did end up being allowed on MDI. So Mr. Train did not get his way. In addition to writing this really fantastic prophecy about what would happen if automobiles came to MDI, I saw some other great books that Mr. Train wrote, one of which was called The True Stories of Celebrated Crimes. True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Train, formerly Assistant District Attorney of New York. This was published in 1908, so this was right after he wrote the prophecy. I'll read from the preface. The narratives composing this book are literally true stories of crime. In a majority of the cases, the author conducted the prosecutions himself, and therefore may claim to have a personal knowledge of that whereof he speaks. While no confidence has been abused, no essential facts have been omitted, distorted, or colored, and the accounts themselves, being all matters of public record, may be easily verified. The scenes here are not literature, but history, and the characters who figure in them are not puppets of the imagination, but men and women who lived and schemed, laughed, sinned, and suffered, and paid the price when the time came, most of them without flinching. So this book that I just mentioned, The True Stories of Celebrated Crimes, you'll see here includes reproductions of evidence that he used in his cases, such as letters, checks, and notes. I also found another book called From the District Attorney series by Arthur Train. I believe it's a 4-volume novel. He calls himself then formerly Assistant District Attorney of New York County. This is called Courts and Criminals, published in 1912. And one of the things I found kind of humorous was some of the chapter titles, such as Chapter 1, The Pleasant Fiction of the Presumption of Innocence. Chapter 6, Detectives Who Detects. Chapter 7, Woman in the Courts. Now, being the time that it was, and possibly the opinions of that time, I decided to check out what Woman in the Courts had to say. And of course, it was exactly what I thought. Here are some quotes from Woman in the Courts. Don't trust them as witnesses is essentially his point. She has never been taught to reason and has never really found it necessary, having wandered through life by inference, or more frankly, by guesswork, until she is no longer able to point out the simplest stages of her most ordinary mental processes. He also claims that women are more ready to commit perjury because once they've said something, it's a matter of pride that they stick by it. So even though he ends up going on to kind of compliment women in some ways, they're always just veiled insults. I do want to say he could have some charming moments in one of his Ephraim Tutt stories about it takes place in Bar Harbor. There's a rich family of high society that moves or is staying in Bar Harbor, and they want their daughter to marry another social high society man, and she ends up falling for a lobsterman. Or actually, it's the other way around. A high society man falls for a lobstering woman. It's incredible. That's called The Viking's Daughter. So if anybody's interested in that, go check that out. So in addition to doing some research on Google Books, which is where I found these digitized train books, I also used historytrust.org, which has an easy search feature for digital archive that has 14 different organizations, local history contributing to it. I found The Pot and Kettle from 1899 to 1987. This is a book of their history and some photos and their bylaws and interesting things like that. And it showed that Arthur Train was a member. He was also their secretary from 1929 to 1930 and their clerk from 1925 to 1933. I also found through Digital Archive in Jessup Memorial Library's collection that Arthur Train was their vice president of their board right at the time of his death. And he is on this, I believe it's kind of like their annual appeal. And the top says, "Are you ready for the peace?" And this is in 1945. So I think we can imagine that everyone in the world was ready for the peace just then. So I'm going to end my screen share here. Okay, so at this time, I just wanted to check on my Facebook Live and see if I have any questions on there. And I didn't have any questions come in on Zoom. So I don't have any questions. If you do have any questions about Arthur Train or the upcoming edition of Chebacco, we're always available at info@mdihistory.org. We'll be back next week for another edition of Chebacco Chats. That's going to be episode 7, and we'll be welcoming Roberto Rodriguez. He'll be talking about the Boston Automobile Company, which was in Bar Harbor at the turn of the 20th century. So one thing I would welcome from our Chebacco Chats community is that when you receive your Chebacco Chats, which will be coming to you in the next few weeks here, I would love for you to read this reprint of Arthur Train's prophecy and share with us some of the things that you recognize have come to pass. One thing I notice that has definitely come to pass are that we have had some deadly accidents on the island. And we do have some sightseeing tours that sound a little similar to the one that Arthur Train took himself. But there are also some things that definitely haven't come to pass, or events such as wildfires that didn't happen for the reasons he predicted. And so it would really interest us for you to write to us and let us know some of the things that you recognize as being truly prophetic and others that were just fantastical and propaganda. So thank you for tuning in. Again, we're always available at info@mdihistory.org, or you can check out our website, mdihistory.org. Thank you so much for tuning in and have a good night.